300 feet underground. The radio crackled like it was chewing gravel. The air smelled metallic, tense, impatient. My boots were planted beside the elevator control panel, eyes locked on the load readings, climbing past what the system liked to admit out loud. Everything down here moved slower for a reason. Gravity didn't care about deadlines. Before we continue, I have a small note. This story contains dramatized details and uses AI-assisted storytelling to highlight real workplace lessons. If this isn't the right moment for you, it's okay to pause, rest, and come back when you're ready. Your well-being matters. Then, CEO Howard Cross's voice cut through the static. Hurry up! We're burning daylight. He always sounded most confident when he wasn't the one standing next to the risk. I pressed the transmit button and kept my voice even. The elevator draw was spiking, past tolerance, past the point where you shrugged and hoped. We need to pause, I said. The electrical load is exceeding standard limits. 5 minutes to run diagnostics. A short laugh came back through the radio. Not nervous, not curious. Dismissive. You worry too much. That's why you're replaceable. The word hit harder than the noise. Replaceable. As if safety was a mood. As if procedures were opinions. I could hear the crew around me go quiet. They heard it too. Everyone did. Howard didn't lower his voice. He didn't step aside. He made it public. Lyra Keller, he said. Like he was reading a number off a spreadsheet. You're done. Hand off and clear the area. We're moving forward. That was it. No meeting, no paperwork. Fired in the middle of an active operation. 300 feet below ground. Over an open channel. I didn't argue. I didn't ask him to repeat himself. I didn't remind him that I was the final legal authority on elevator safety for this site. The one name regulators looked for when things went wrong. I didn't mention the certifications, the liability chain, or the signatures already on file. Howard chased speed. He hated process. He called it drag. He called people like me obstacles. I reached for the panel and felt the weight of the badge at my chest. The room was silent now, waiting for me to explode. Instead, I leaned into the radio and said one word. Understood. Then I pulled my authorization card from the control console and let the system decide what happened next. Have you ever felt like you were just a number? Nothing more. If you've ever experienced that feeling, you're not alone, and these stories exist to remind us that human value doesn't disappear just because someone disregards it. Subscribe to the channel, not just for yourself, but to help spread lessons about fairness, responsibility, and respect in the workplace. The word followed me as I stood there, 300 feet underground. Staring at the panel, I had protected more times than I could count. I remembered the near misses they never put in press releases. A cable overheating at dawn. A brake delay no one else noticed. A power fluctuation that would have dropped the car if I hadn't stopped it. Every time. Howard called it hesitation. He said I slowed momentum. He said I made people nervous. What he never said was thank you. Those same reports, stripped of context and caution, ended up in the IPO deck. Clean charts, perfect safety percentages. My work, polished into proof that nothing could possibly go wrong. Howard loved those slides. He loved pointing at numbers that made him look bold. He never loved the person who kept those numbers honest. Back in the present. His voice carried easily through the radio. He was smiling somewhere above ground. I could hear it. We're about to break production records, he announced, like it was a victory over gravity itself. The crew shifted uncomfortably. No one clapped. Then the order came. Lyra, clear the area immediately. That was all. No explanation, no acknowledgement of what I was responsible for, or what removing me actually meant. No one asked whether firing the site's safety authority during an active operation was legal. No one asked because no one wanted to. I stepped back from the console, bitterness tightening in my chest. The system responded faster than any human in that mine ever had. The display flickered, recalculated, and settled on a single line of text. Primary Safety Authority disconnected. For the first time all day. The numbers stopped lying. I stayed silent. Because silence was the only language the system still respected down there. The moment my authorization card left the console, everything slowed, not because I hesitated, but because the system finally had clarity. I didn't smash buttons or trigger alarms. I followed the only step the law allowed when responsibility was revoked. I withdrew personal oversight and let the protocols stand on their own. The interface recalibrated without drama. Indicators shifted from active supervision to safe hold mode. Exactly as designed, power balanced, load stabilized. The elevator came to a controlled stop, smooth enough that no one lost their footing. No alarm screamed, no metal groaned. No one was trapped. The system wasn't angry, it was obedient. I stayed still, hands off the panel, breathing evenly. Control isn't noise. Control is restraint. Every instinct to explain myself stayed locked behind my teeth. The rules were clear. Once authority is removed, intervention becomes interference. I wouldn't give them that. Howard's voice tore through the radio, sharp and panicked now. Who shut this down? I waited a beat, just long enough for the question to hang unanswered. No one. I said. The system did. That was the truth. And it landed harder than any accusation. The software was responding to a vacuum they created. Safety systems don't negotiate. They don't care about titles or tempers. They only ask one question: who is legally accountable right now? The silence that followed told me everything. No credentials remained on site. No certified authority could assume control without violating protocol. They could shout, threaten, promise, but none of it mattered. The switch had already been thrown by their own decision. I felt no triumph, only certainty. This wasn't revenge. It was compliance, executed perfectly, for years. I'd been accused of slowing things down. Now the process was moving at its natural speed. Indifferent to ego, above ground. They would scramble for answers, below ground. The system waited, calm and unmoving, for someone who no longer existed. And for the first time, absolute control belonged to the rules, not the people who thought they owned them. Nothing else was required, and nothing more could legally be done there. The first call came less than a minute after the elevator settled into safe hold mode. Then another, then 3 more. My radio stayed quiet, but my phone vibrated nonstop in my pocket, as if panic had learned how to dial. I finally answered when the name on the screen stopped changing. Calvin Stroud, the CFO. His voice was tight, polished fear wrapped in corporate courtesy. He said we needed to be reasonable. He said I should cooperate. He said this could all be smoothed over if I helped restore operations quickly. I can't. I told him I was fired. There was a pause. The sound of someone realizing they had skipped an important line in the script. Calvin tried again. Softer this time. Asking me to think about the company, the investors, the consequences. I reminded him that consequences were exactly why I no longer had authority. The radio crackled back to life. The head of legal spoke carefully, every word measured. Who is the certified authority right now? No one answered. Not the site manager, not operations, not Calvin. Silence stretched, heavy and unmistakable. It wasn't defiance, it was absence. A technician finally spoke up, voice low. He said he wouldn't touch the system without a certified supervisor present. He said prison sentences weren't covered by overtime. No one argued with that. If you've ever watched leadership unravel in real time, you know the sound. It's not shouting. It's hesitation layered over itself. I wonder what you would have done in their place, knowing every option carried personal risk. Minutes later, the final confirmation arrived. Insurance coverage was temporarily suspended due to non-compliance with safety governance. That single sentence did more damage than any shutdown ever could. The call stopped after that, above ground. Panic spread room to room, searching for a decision-maker who no longer existed. Below ground, everything remained still. The system hadn't failed. It was waiting. And for the first time, no one was in control. What mattered most was that the cost of speed finally became visible to everyone listening above and below ground. The paper trail surfaced faster than anyone expected. Once the shutdown froze production, internal systems began pulling records automatically, flagging approvals that no longer matched active governance. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. I knew exactly where the trail would lead, because I had argued against it months earlier. Emails were reopened, meeting notes resurfaced, red lines appeared on documents no one thought mattered anymore. Buried beneath optimistic forecasts and celebratory language was a single decision that explained everything. Howard Cross had personally signed off on removing the secondary oversight layer for elevator safety, labeling it redundant. The justification was efficiency. The timing aligned perfectly with the accelerated IPO schedule. I imagined the room growing quiet as that signature appeared on the screen. All the noise about hesitation and replaceability suddenly sounded childish. This wasn't a technical glitch. It wasn't operator error. It was a deliberate shortcut, preserved in black and white, complete with timestamps and legal acknowledgments. The head of legal spoke next. Her tone didn't rise or soften. It didn't accuse. It simply clarified. "This isn't a system failure," she said. "It's leadership." That sentence did more damage than any alarm ever could. It reframed the entire crisis, stripping away excuses and exposing intent. Procedures had worked. Safeguards had responded. The only thing that broke was the assumption that speed could outrun accountability. I felt a bitter calm settle in. For years, I'd been treated like an obstacle for insisting on documentation. Now, those same documents were dismantling the narrative built around me. There was irony in that, sharp enough to sting. Silence followed, the kind that precedes decisions no one wants to make. Then the board chair spoke, briefly and without debate. An emergency session was being convened immediately. Attendance was mandatory. Phones were silenced. Calendars were cleared. I looked at the darkened console beside me and understood the final twist. This story was no longer about a stopped elevator. It was about who had signed what, and when, and by morning. Leadership would be answering questions it could no longer outrun them. Don't leave, yet the next part is where everything starts to shift. By morning, ambition began to collapse under its own weight. The first rumor didn't come from inside the mine, but from outside it. A compliance bulletin circulated quietly, stating that operations were suspended due to the absence of a legally certified safety authority. It was factual, bloodless, and devastating. Partners reacted before executives could. Calls were canceled, site visits postponed. One by one, financial backers stepped away, not loudly, but decisively. No one wanted their name attached to a project suddenly labeled high risk. Speed had lost its shine the moment accountability went missing. The IPO timetable unraveled just as cleanly. Lawyers advised delays. Banks asked questions no one could answer. Prospectuses were quietly pulled from distribution. What had been framed as momentum only hours earlier was now described as exposure. The market doesn't panic. It recalculates. Howard Cross refused to adjust. On every call, he repeated the same story. I was emotional. I was obstructive. I had acted independently. It was easier for him to attack a person than explain a signature. I listened from a distance, detached, hearing my name used as insulation against reality. But narratives don't survive documentation. As pressure mounted, the board shifted from reassurance to containment. Conversations stopped, including Howard. Decisions started happening without him. When leadership becomes the variable, stability demands subtraction. That realization landed late in the evening. An emergency notice went out. Brief and unmistakable. The board required Howard to step aside temporarily while matters were reviewed. No applause followed, no outrage, just a necessary correction. I didn't celebrate. I watched ambition finally meet its limit. The system hadn't punished anyone. It had simply removed the illusion that urgency could replace responsibility. And everything built on that illusion fell with surprising speed. Above ground, silence replaced confidence. And every unanswered call echoed the same lesson: momentum without structure collapses fast. And leadership without restraint leaves nothing stable behind. By nightfall, the numbers spoke louder than any executive could. The hearing began without ceremony. No speeches, no posturing, just a long table and faces that no longer smiled. I was invited not as an employee, but as an independent safety expert, a distinction that mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. I took my seat and kept my hands folded. I didn't accuse, I didn't argue. I opened the operating manual and read page numbers, thresholds, authority chains, the rules everyone had signed and then ignored. Each sentence landed with quiet weight, because procedures don't need emotion to be effective. Howard sat across from me, shifting. He interrupted once, then twice, insisting context mattered, that leadership required flexibility. His voice rose when no one responded. He demanded to know why I hadn't warned him. I kept reading. Warnings only count when someone listens. The room changed. What began as a review became an exposure. The more Howard spoke, the smaller his words sounded. Control slipped. Not because I challenged him, but because process refused to bend around ego. Power doesn't vanish loudly, it drains. When the legal review reached the termination clause, the chair paused. The language was clear. Dismissals issued during active hazardous operations invalidate themselves. The policy existed to prevent exactly what had happened. Howard's decision, made publicly and impulsively, never legally stood. The conclusion was delivered without drama. The termination was void. Authority had never transferred. My status. At the moment, the system entered safe hold, remained intact. The irony settled slowly across the table. I closed the manual. No one applauded. No one apologized. They didn't need to. The balance had already shifted, for the first time since the shutdown. I felt something ease, not satisfaction, but alignment. Power hadn't returned to me. It had corrected itself. And Howard, suddenly silent, finally understood that speed doesn't create authority. Structure does. The hearing ended there, but its outcome had already rewritten everything that came after. That realization followed me as I stood up, knowing the process had spoken clearly, and no title left in that room could argue back again. Calmly, legally, finally, without noise there, legally. The conclusion was almost insulting in its simplicity. I had never been fired, not in any way that held weight. The termination Howard announced over the radio, mid-operation, failed the most basic requirement of validity under hazardous conditions. Authority cannot be severed that way. On paper, my role had never ended. Howard's did. By the time the board's decision became public, his title was already past tense. Interim leadership was appointed. Access was revoked. The same system he trusted to erase me recorded his removal with perfect neutrality. I watched it happen from a distance, feeling no rush of victory, only a thin, cold irony settle in. The call came later that afternoon. The board asked if I would return temporarily to stabilize operations. They spoke carefully, as if tone alone could undo what had been said underground. I listened without interrupting. They didn't ask me back as an employee. They asked me back because the system would not move without someone who understood it. I agreed, but not without conditions. I outlined them calmly. Independent status, full operational authority, written protection from executive interference, transparent reporting to the board, no exceptions, no urgency clauses disguised as leadership. Silence followed each point. Then acceptance. Desperation is a powerful negotiator. The final document arrived shortly after. Consulting agreement, limited term, clear scope, and compensation set at 3 times my previous salary. The number wasn't an apology, it was an admission. I signed without hesitation, not because I needed the money, but because the terms acknowledged reality. They didn't want me back. They needed me. As I prepared to return underground, I understood the quiet punchline. I hadn't been fired. I had been proven indispensable by the same rules meant to replace me. Howard chased speed and lost everything. I followed process and walked back in on my own terms, coldly aware that systems remember what people try to forget. That lesson stayed with me as the doors closed and the descent resumed under rules that no longer bent for anyone. Cold order restored. Authority finally aligned with responsibility. I returned underground calmly, authorized again, not triumphant, just focused on restoring what had been paused. The console recognized my credentials instantly, as if the system itself had been waiting patiently there. I followed procedure step by step. No shortcuts, no speeches, no sense of ceremony or celebration. Safe hold mode disengaged smoothly. Power redistributed, and the elevator resumed motion exactly as designed intended. The car descended and rose without drama, steel and cable behaving with disciplined indifference, again quietly. No alarms sounded, no one shouted, and no mistakes demanded explanations from anxious supervisors above ground. The crew watched silently, unsure whether relief or resentment was the appropriate response now for them. I kept my hands steady, eyes forward, letting the system speak for itself without any commentary. This was never about winning, only about returning control to rules that endure beyond ego. Ambition. Above ground. Conversations had shifted from confidence to containment, from speed to liability overnight quickly, decisively. I learned later that regulators had opened an individual inquiry into Howard's decisions regarding workplace safety. His name appeared alone on the notice, detached from the company he once commanded publicly. Formally, no announcement marked that moment underground, only a deeper silence settling afterward between us. All present. I completed the final checklist, signed the log, and powered the system fully back online. Safely. There was no applause, no gratitude, and no attempt to rewrite recent history from anyone there. I preferred it that way, because silence confirms resolution better than praise ever could alone. Honestly, when the elevator doors closed again, the weight felt different, lighter somehow inside my chest. Finally, control had returned quietly, not to a person, but to the process designed, tested, enforced, respected. That was the victory, uncelebrated, precise, and impossible to argue with by anyone watching, listening, remembering. I stepped away, knowing systems don't seek credit. They simply record outcomes without bias, delay, mercy, before leaving the site for the last time. I stopped at the edge of the shaft and looked down. The machinery hummed steadily, indifferent to names, titles, or past arguments. It was working, safely, because rules were being followed again. The word floated back to me without invitation. Replaceable. Howard had thrown it like a shortcut, a way to end a conversation he didn't want to have. He believed people could be swapped the way components were, without consequence. The mine had answered him better than I ever could. I understood then what this ending really was. Not revenge, not triumph, just alignment. Howard disappeared quietly after the investigation concluded. No press statements, no dramatic exit. In this industry, silence means credibility is gone. Boards remember, regulators remember longer. I didn't linger. I signed the final report, handed over the badge, and walked toward the lift without looking back. Some things don't need closure scenes or speeches. People aren't replaceable. Responsibility isn't. The system recorded the outcome, archived the lessons, and moved on. So did I, leaving justice behind me. I felt small in that moment, dismissed, reduced to a word that stung more than the firing itself. But standing inside the system, I helped protect. I realized something steadier than anger took over. Processes exist to protect people when power fails them, and dignity isn't something anyone can revoke with a sentence. If you've ever felt invisible at work, pressured to move faster than what feels right, I hope this story reminded you that caution is not weakness, and silence can be strength. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't look heroic in the moment. It just looks lonely. But it lasts. If you stayed with me until the end, thank you, truly. That means more than you know. Are you listening from home, from work, from somewhere quiet tonight? I'd love to know where you are. If this story resonated, consider leaving a comment and sharing your thoughts. A like or a share helps these lessons reach someone else who might need them. And if you choose to subscribe, you're not just supporting a channel, you're helping keep stories like this alive.